Hello, I'm Geraint. I'm also Signalsmith, mostly online. I head up Signalsmith Audio, a DSP and algorithm design consultancy. I'm here to talk about pitch shifting. So I'll start with a map of what we're going to cover. Firstly, what is a pitch shifter, what we want it to do or not to do. And then I'll talk about pitch shifting and time stretching, because these are related problems, and if you can solve one, you can adapt that to solve the other. With that in mind, we'll look at a very simple time stretcher based on just chopping the waveform up into chunks and moving those chunks around in time. It won't sound great, but we'll look at some ways it can be improved. We'll end up in the neighborhood of some familiar acronyms, but I don't have a lot of time to go into deep depth for most of these, partly because there are other talks at this conference that covered or will cover them, and partly because these work best when given monophonic tonal instruments, so solo instrument or voice. And I'd like to shift polyphonic instruments, piano or guitar, or in fact, entire mixes all at once. For that, we need some kind of frequency domain processing. So I'm going to go through what it takes for an FFT-based frequency domain effect, and then we're going to look at a pretty basic frequency domain pitch shifter based on chopping up the spectrum into chunks and moving those up and down in frequency. Then I'm going to jump a bit, and I'm going to talk about multiband processing, where you split your signal into multiple subbands, and you process those individually before recombining them. I'm specifically going to consider the quite extreme case, where you have like thousands of bands, and why that would be very useful if you're writing a time stretcher. Then, I'm not going to show you a bunch of maths, because it's a bit early in the morning. I'm going to ask you to follow me on a leap of intuition, as I claim that these two things are, in fact, the same. Frequency domain and multiband processing can be two perspectives on the same calculations and data. Armed with this insight, we're going to look at the phase vocoder, a basic and widely known frequency domain time stretcher. It has some flaws, one of which is how it deals with transients. They come out very diffuse and indistinct. So I'll talk about how, if you can detect transients, you can use that to improve your phase vocoder. For our fourth approach, we'll start with the phase vocoder's evil twin. So the phase vocoder is a time stretcher which is great at preserving tonal information, but it drops some of that timing information. Its counterpart is a pitch shifter, which is great at preserving timing information, but drops some tonal information. This might not sound very useful, but we can combine the two into a hybrid pitch and time stretcher aiming to preserve both tonal and timing information. I'll be talking about this in fairly sort of conceptual terms, but the basic form of this sounds pretty good, particularly for more modest changes. And I'll finish up with a bit of hand-waving and pointing vaguely towards some ways you can make it both high quality and work for more extreme stretches of more than an octave or twice in time. And that's the talk, so let's get going. Say you have some waveform, and when you play it, you get a sound. If you stretch this waveform out in time, changing the playback rate, then as well as getting longer, it also gets transposed because all the oscillations in the input are now oscillating more slowly. Let's have a listen. Here's our input audio, which we're going to hear a lot in this presentation. Here it is stretched out by 50%, which also transposes down by 7 semitones. Similarly, if you squish it in time, it gets higher. Okay, so the goal of a pitch shifter is to get that change in pitch we just heard, but while preserving the tempo and duration. A couple of other things we don't want. No extra inharmonic artifacts. We don't want it to be echoey or diffuse. This would be particularly bad for things like drums, which have very strong and important transients. We also don't want it to be uneven. If the input is smooth, the output should be smooth. The goals of a time stretcher are pretty similar, just that we're now changing the tempo and duration while preserving the pitch. If you have a time stretcher but you want a pitch shifter, you can take your waveform, time stretch it out, preserving the pitch, and then do a playback rate change to get the original duration back and also add a pitch shift at the same time because they change together. Similarly, if you have a pitch shifter and want a time stretcher, you could change the playback rate and then use the pitch shifter to restore your pitch. Or you could do this two operations the other way around. That kind of works both ways. If you're dealing with an offline audio effect, that adaptation is really that simple. Changing the playback rate of digital audio is just changing the sample rate. And then maybe you need to resample to get to the output rate you really need. If you're adapting a time stretcher to be a pitch shifter as an interactive audio effect, it's a bit trickier. You'll be given a small chunk of input and asked to produce the same number of output samples. Conceptually, we're still stretching this out with the context of all the input that's gone before, and then resampling to get our output. But although our input and output blocks are nice lengths, this intermediate waveform is an awkward length that depends on your pitch shifting ratio, and the correct length might not be a whole number of samples. So you can solve this. You end up with fractional leftover samples for both your time stretcher and your resampler. It can be done. The example code for or the demo sounds in this presentation takes the easy way out and avoids this because it's annoying and I didn't want to write it. But this is only a problem when you're adapting a time stretcher to be a pitch shifter. Half the methods we'll look at today do pitch shifting directly, so it's simply not a problem. Now, before I really get into it, I'll give you a little preview of where we're going to end up. So here's our input audio again. Here it is shifted up by 2 semitones. Down by 3 semitones. And for fun, stretched out by 25%. Okay, so we'll get there, but first we'll look at our very simple method. You have some waveform and you want it to be a different length, say shorter. Now, as we've seen, you can't just squish the waveform, but what we can do is copy chunks out of the input, and then we move those chunks around in time. In order to recombine them, we need to do some kind of crossfading or tapering, but then we can just add them back together to get our output. Any events in the input audio are moved very straightforwardly through time. But because the playback rate of each individual chunk is preserved, if our chunk is long enough to catch some frequency or pitch information from the input, that is preserved in the output. So let's have a listen. We're going to compress this sound to 60% of its duration. Okay, so that was actually, it kind of worked. It's shorter, you preserved the pitch, but we're going to listen again, and there's this definite fluttering sound. We'll get to it in a second. Don't know how much you can hear on this system in this room, but it's there. A couple of practical notes first. Although I have explained this as copying chunks out of the input and moving them around, there are some problems with that. One of which is if you try and stretch too much, you get gaps between your chunks. Now, you could put more chunks in, but generally I find it easier to think about this stuff from the output and then working backwards. So we're going to decide where the output blocks should be, and even how they should be crossfaded, and then ask where in the input should these blocks come from. Another thing that we should mention is what shape the crossfading should be. A simple intuitive requirement is if we're not changing the duration, then our output should exactly match the input. So as you can see from this diagram, the crossfading curves should kind of add up nicely with themselves so that you perfectly reconstruct the input as the output. In a streaming kind of API, you won't be constructing the whole output waveform in a big for loop. You'll be asked for short chunks of output at a time. And what you need to do here is maintain some summing buffer of unused future output. And when you get a block, you add it into this summing buffer, at which point you can output from this buffer until things progress far enough that you need the next sample. In a plug-in kind of situation, you won't have access to the whole input waveform at once. So you'll be given short chunks of the input, and you'll need to maintain a recent history of input in a circular buffer or something, and then when you need a block, you take it from one block length in the past. So this fixed delay makes sure there's always enough waveform to fill the block. And one more note, if you're adapting this time stretcher to be a pitch shifter, then you'll end up changing the playback rate of the output waveform. But you can move that step earlier and change the playback rate of the individual blocks. So here, each of these blocks is a playback rate shifted section of the input. So even though the length isn't changing, this is an overlap add pitch shifter. Okay, now, At this point, I'd love to show you some C++ example code, but I have chosen a very ambitious scope for this talk. So it will all be on GitHub. This is the URL. I'm going to do a git push straight after this. And yeah, hopefully with the explanations from this talk, it will make sense. Now, I said I was going to get to that fluttering sound. The problem is phase cancellation. When you copy your chunks out of the input, they're all phase aligned, right? But the moment you start moving chunks around in time, then they can get out of phase. So in this pure tone example, however we crossfade these blocks, there's going to be some phase cancellation. Another problem is if there's a transient in the input, it can be copied into multiple blocks. And then when those blocks move around in time, the transient ends up duplicated. Both of these can be, well, not solved, but improved by being a bit flexible about where the blocks are in time. So this is our set of output blocks we're about to sum together, and maybe this would be a bad crossfade. But perhaps if we nudged these blocks a little bit in time, we get a better crossfade. This is either the Wazola or Zola method, depending whether you're changing the output block position or where they come from in the input. But both of them kind of require some metric for what a good crossfade is. A nice simple one is to add up the difference between the waveforms across the period where they would overlap. It could be the absolute value or the difference squared. So this would be a bad crossfade. They're out of phase. There's a lot of difference. If we shift this second block, they're much closer together. This is a better crossfade. So yeah, let's have a listen. We're going to take our input, time stretch it out by 26%, and then do a playback rate change to convert that to a 4-semitone pitch shift. Here is our original overlap add method. You can hopefully hear that fluttering sound. Here is what it sounds like if each block is allowed to move up to 10 milliseconds in each direction to find a good overlap. It's still not perfect, but it's improved. We've avoided some of the phase cancellation by wiggling the blocks around in time. Now, I don't have time to go into all the different overlap add things. I'm going to quickly highlight Psola because I think it's cool. In Psola, as opposed to taking your blocks long enough to capture pitch information, your blocks are really short, and they're spaced out at 1 wavelength intervals. This lets you control the pitch by moving the blocks closer and further apart. And then you can control time by duplicating or removing blocks. In fact, you can control timbre as well by stretching the blocks out to change the performance. But this method kind of assumes that there is a single frequency to lock onto. And even the Wazola method performs best when there's a single really clearly repeating pattern so it can find offsets. As I said, I'd like to pitch shift polyphonic instruments or full mixes. So welcome to the frequency domain. We're going to start with the same overlap add processing we had before. The only difference is, as opposed to just copying chunks of the input, we're going to do some kind of block-based processing to each one before we taper it and add it into the output. What kind of block-based processing? Well, I'm going to just kind of hope that most of you know what the Fourier transform in the FFT is, how its inputs and outputs work vaguely, and this idea that it produces a spectrum from a waveform. I am going to highlight one thing, though, which is the FFT isn't very happy when you give it a chunk of audio where the start and end of the block don't match up. It perceives that as a discontinuity and spends a lot of information trying to reconstruct it. What we're going to do is we will, before we hand the waveform to the FFT, we're going to taper it so that the start and end match up nicely. This gives us a clearer spectrum. Okay, so we've got our overlap add block processing, and we're doing something in the middle. The something is, we'll take our chunk of input, taper it, hand it to the FFT to get a spectrum, then we'll modify that spectrum however we like, hand that to the inverse FFT to get back a chunk of waveform again, which will then taper and add into the output. Now, another note about the shape of these taperings, if you're not actually changing the spectrum, then intuitively your output should match your input again. So if all you do is apply both fading stages to each block, they should add up together nicely, just as they did before. In this kind of setup where each block starts halfway through the previous one, it all adds up nicely, perfect reconstruction, if you use this sine window, windowing is the tapering, for both stages of your crossfading. But in practice, you might want to use more overlap. Not really for the time resolution, more because this lets you use smoother windowing functions, which give you even clearer spectrums. Okay, so now we know how to mess around with the frequency content of each block. What do you want to do? Here I've sketched out what the spectrum of one of these blocks might look like, and you've got these clear peaks here, which should correspond to kind of audible harmonic components in our block. What we kind of want is this, right? It's the same rough shape, but all the peaks have been moved to new positions, multiplied by some frequency scaling factor. The problem is, we've just plotted the energy here. We have completely ignored the phase. And phase is very important in the spectrum. Particularly, relative phase between nearby frequencies is kind of how time is encoded in the spectrum. Here's an example. If our block just contains a single transient, then our spectrum might look like this, big, wide mush of frequencies. But it would look the same if the transient was at the end of the block instead of the start. The only difference between these two cases is the phase. So if we get the phase wrong for our output spectrum, we'll get anything from a fluttering sound to a big, diffuse, timeless mess. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and identify regions of the spectrum that we think are important, probably centered around these frequency peaks, and then we're going to move them to different points in the spectrum, just copy and paste to a different offset within the array, so that we move these peaks to where we think they should be. Let's have a quick listen to how this might sound. That was a 4 semitone shift up. Let's listen to 4 semitones down. So that's pretty smooth. It's tuneful. I think it's the best so far. The transients are slightly softened. So I'm going to play the original input, and possibly not for the people in this room, but maybe if on YouTube later, you can hear that the drums are slightly clearer in the original. So the problem here is that we've made really sharp edits in the spectrum. And even though we've tried to pick unimportant areas of the spectrum, we're still disrupting these carefully balanced phases and frequencies from nearby frequencies. And how this exhibits in the waveform in the time domain is the timing just gets a bit less focused. So where we should have a really clean focused transient, energy starts to leak out a little bit before and afterwards. And before gives us pre-ringing, so we get the slight anticipation of all the transients, which really softens them. It's not great. Another issue, which we just skated over completely, is phase cancellation. Just as before, this is our sort of partially summed output, which we're in the middle of constructing, and we're about to add another block in. And we've been messing with the spectrum. There is no guarantee that these are going to be phase aligned at this point. Previously, we tried to solve this by moving the block in time to find a better match. But we have another option available to us now. We can apply a phase shift to all the frequencies. So we can shift every frequency by 90 degrees or 45 or whatever to try and find a good match with the output that we had before. In fact, we can choose a different phase rotation for every one of our spectral segments. And I'm not going to tell you how to find a good phase rotation. You're welcome to look at my example code and figure out what I've done, or just have a think about it and see what you would do. Maybe it'll be better. What I am going to point out is when you take the FFT of some waveform, the phases in your spectrum are relative to some reference time, some t equals 0. But when you computed the spectrum of the previous block, it was computed with a different reference time, which is generally the 0th index of your waveform array. If you compare these two spectra in a very direct way, you can get in a tangle. So what we need is actually a nice way to take the same spectrum that we already computed and kind of adjust the phases so that they have a different reference time. If we can do that, then we can much more simply compare the two spectra and the phases between them because they'll have the same reference time, and it'll make more sense. This is the first equation of the morning. And this is the phase shift that you want. Or you can just look at my example code and see what I did. This is a linear phase shift. Every frequency in the spectrum is twisted a little bit more than the previous one. It's not too bad. Now, we have a pitch shifter here. And we've done this thing where we've got our FFTs, and then we're kind of chopping it up and applying phase shift to different segments. But hang on. The phase cancellation that we avoided was exactly the main problem of this overlap add time stretching that we had in the first section. So can we just use that here? And the answer is, yeah. If for all of these blocks in our time stretcher, we chop our spectrum up into segments, and even if we're not doing a phase shift, we find a time stretch, sorry, we do the phase shift on these individual spectral segments to avoid this phase cancellation between blocks. And it works. So here's a 20% pitch shift using this method. The transients are slightly softened in that as well, but it's a lot better than the previous attempt, which was this Risola stuff. So let's listen to that for comparison. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's a bit more uneven. Okay, at this point, I'm going to show you a spectrogram. This is a nice illustration of energy against time and frequency. So the energy at any given time frequency point corresponds to the intensity of the color. This is related to our block-based FFT processing because each vertical slice, each column of pixels, corresponds to the spectrum of one of our blocks. Previously, we had this plot where the peaks were, the energy peaks were sort of up and down, and now the energy peaks are these points of more intense color in our spectrogram. Maybe it makes more sense if you kind of rotate this right-hand graph, or maybe it doesn't. This is a spectrogram, and we're going to keep using it to illustrate the waveform because I think it's a nice intuitive representation. Okay, halfway there, hopefully. You can tell me what time it is. So multiband processing is when you have a few different filters, each of which pass through a different range of frequencies. And we use this to split the input into multiple subbands, which then add together nicely if you've chosen your filters correctly. The advantage of this is we get to do some processing on each of these frequency bands separately. A classic example would be you put a compressor on them, and then you get a multi-band compressor. But how does this help with time stretching or pitch shifting? Well, okay, the full waveform here is just quite complex. There's a lot going on. If you take a little slice of the spectrum, you only let through some of them, there's less information in our signal, right? It's a simpler signal. In fact, if our band is really narrow, you can maybe say, well, there's probably only one frequency in here at a time, right? If it's sufficiently narrow, one note might have one harmonic which lands in this band. This is a simplifying assumption, not quite true, but it lets us use a cool time stretching method, which is resynthesis. So here we have a signal which is just a sine wave, but it changes frequency and amplitude over time. If we can do some analysis to get the envelopes for this amplitude and frequency change, then we can very simply stretch these envelopes over time and then resynthesize a new signal following the same kind of pattern. For a real valued signal, I don't know, maybe you could track zero crossings or measure peaks and so on, but for a complex signal, a complex sinusoid, this is dead easy. Complex sinusoids have a real and imaginary part which kind of circle around each other. Here's a little fancy animation. But the point is that to get the amplitude envelope of a complex sinusoid, you just take the absolute value at any point. And to get the frequency, you look at how fast the phase is changing. If it's changing really slowly, that's a low frequency. If the phase is changing really fast, that's a high frequency. So here's our plan. We're going to take our full audio, chop it up into really thin slices, and each slice needs to be complex. If you're familiar with the Hilbert transform, it's kind of like that. And it needs to be very narrow, so that only one frequency lands in at a time. How narrow? Well, here I've marked 50 hertz on our spectrogram, and you can see these harmonics at the bottom are really close together. If we want these harmonics to all land in separate bands, our bands need to be significantly narrower than 50 hertz. This is the point where I'm not going to show you a bunch of maths. I'm trying to build up the intuition of how these things work, and you can work through the equations later, but I don't think that's the best way to get to that kind of intuition. And the intuition goes like this. We need really narrow bands, like 1 pixel high on our spectrogram kind of narrow. But hang on, the values in this spectrogram, each column was the spectrum of one of our blocks. This is a series of complex values for different frequencies. If we look at a sequence of these spectra over time, and we take, I don't know, the 100th entry or bin from each one, That is a sequence over time of complex numbers that somehow correspond to what's happening at a particular frequency. Is this a very narrow band, complex filter taken out from an input? And yeah, kind of. So as opposed to, when we get a spectrum from our block, as opposed to saying, here's a spectrum with 1,000 entries in it, we're going to think, here is one new sample for each of our 1,000 subbands. Now, if you want to type something into a search engine to read more, this is your magic phrase. But a key word here is downsampled, because we only get these new samples when there's a new block. Our blocks might only be happening at 30 millisecond intervals. So each of these subbands is somehow running at 33 hertz, but they represent frequencies which are like way higher. This turns out to not be a problem in terms of like the sampling theorem and stuff, but it's a bit weird. And if you try and estimate the frequency from them in a straightforward, like what's the phase difference kind of way, you'll get values in this like plus or minus 16 hertz range, which for most bands won't be what's happening. So what you need to do is you pick some reference frequency, which should be the center of your band. And then you think, well, what would be the phase change if I had a tone at that frequency? That's a kind of reference phase change. You subtract that from what you have, and you're left with this residual phase change compared to a reference frequency. You can get a pitch estimate, frequency estimate from that with the phase change as before, and it will be in this small plus or minus 16 hertz kind of range, but it will be relative to a reference frequency. So this is how you can get a much higher frequency estimate for your subband, which is what you need with this downsampled filter bank. What we've ended up with here is one way to think about the phase vocoder. So to recap, you're doing the same FFT-based block processing as we had for our frequency domain stuff, except instead of saying, here's a spectrum, we say, here is one sample for each of our subbands. For each of these subbands, we're going to do a resynthesis time stretch, and we're going to remember to do our frequency estimations relative to the reference frequency at the center of the band. And another thing we have to note, if we're doing a time stretch, our input blocks are going to be more closely spaced or further apart than our output blocks. So just bear this in mind when you're doing your frequency estimation for your subbands. And then we take one output sample from each subband, wrap that back up in a spectrum, inverse FFT, add it into the output. That's a lot of steps. It's not too bad if you already have one of these frequency domain processors working, at which point most of the work is in your head, doing this perspective shift between the spectrum and these multibands. But it's all totally worth it if you get a crystal clear result. Let's have a listen. So I'm going to play that again. It's very diffuse. The drums have turned into this kind of mess. It sounds a bit more echoey. The problem is these phase relationships between adjacent frequencies or nearby frequencies. When we had our frequency domain processor, we chopped our spectrum up into chunks specifically to preserve the relative phase between these frequencies. But our phase vocoder is processing each subband completely independently. The phases are adrift, and this disconnected set of phases gives us a very mushy time response. There are a couple of things that we can do to try and improve this. One is, well, the filters for our subbands aren't actually perfect, so if you have a single harmonic going on, then multiple bands will actually catch that harmonic. So if you can identify one of them as like the primary band at any given time, then you can phase lock adjacent bands to it. This helps harmonic content. It doesn't really help with transients, but if you can detect transients with any existing method, then a block that contains a sufficiently strong transient, you can perform a phase reset. So as opposed to taking the phase predictions from our phase vocoders, you just copy the phases from the input, instantly restoring the interfrequency phase relationships. There are even some methods which will give you detected transients that only affect part of the spectrum. I can't go into too much detail, but there's a cool one where you take like the median filter across a few different frequencies, which is great at catching transients. You take a similar median across time, which catches sustained tones, and you compare the two to classify things as either transient or sustained. But if you're in a hurry and you're feeling like doing a hack, you can look at the energy change between over time in each subband. So you take the energy of each subband, and you take the energy of the previous sample, and you say, well, if the energy is increasing, I have some kind of proportion here. I can take a metric of transientness between 0 and 1 at that moment in time, and either have some threshold for performing a phase reset, or you can constantly do a partial phase reset. You blend some mixture of the phase predicted by the phase vocoder and the reset phase from the input. So we'll have a little listen to what that would sound like. It's still not perfect. It's a bit indistinct and fuzzy, but some of the presence of these transients and those drums have come back. Now, for that to work, we need to be able to blend phase values. This is sometimes a bit tricky because, okay, here we have two phase values. One's positive and one's negative. If we take the average of the phases, we'll end up with 0, which is in completely the wrong place. What you actually want to do is get your hands on some complex numbers which have those phases. Then you can average those complex numbers and either take the phase of the result or normalize it so that it lies on a unit circle, at which point you can multiply with it to apply that phase shift. You might already have these complex numbers, because if you're getting the phase difference between two complex numbers, like samples in a subband or something, as opposed to taking the phase of each one and subtracting, which has awkward wraparound effects and you have to have a bunch of branching, you can take the conjugate of one, multiply it with the other, and take the phase of that. This gives you the same result, but in much more neat code. But if you're going to be blending this phase with other phases, you could just use this complex value, which has the phase you want. And, okay, one more quick note. If you're doing a very even time stretch, then your map between output time and input time will be a clean straight line. But the phases between subbands only really drift apart when you're doing this time stretch. So if you can detect transients in the input, you could locally set the time map as a 1-to-1 ratio. So you're not actually doing time stretches across the transients. And when you combine this with the phase resets or something, then this preserves that phase relationships across the transient, which helps keep them clearer. Then you have to catch up time in the non-transient sections, and it adds a bit of complication. But this helps almost every time-stretching method keep the transients extra clean and clear. Okay, we're nearly there. So here's another explanation of what we're doing with the phase vocoder. We are assembling a series of output spectrums. And for each frequency in our output spectrum, we need to decide two things. One, what's the energy? And we can decide that very simply by looking at the corresponding time-mapped spectrum in our input and just reading it out from that frequency. The other thing we have to decide is the phase. And for that, we take a phase observation. We measure the phase back in time for both the input and the output. And we use the input one to estimate the local frequency content, and then use that to progress the phase appropriately in the output spectrum. Now, we did have this problem that different frequencies ended up phase disconnected from each other. So we're going to design a pitch shifter. And our primary goal is to get that phase relationship between frequencies right. We're going to nail these transients. So, as before, we're assembling a series of output spectra, and the energy we just take from the input, same spectrum, same time, but mapped in frequency. And to get the phase, we take the phase one step down in both the input and the output, so one bin previously. And then we use that to just exactly reproduce the relative phase between our two adjacent frequencies. Let's have a listen to how that sounds. So it's a little bit garbled, to put it politely, but I'm going to play another example, and I'd like you to note that the drums are clear. So we've absolutely got this timing information solid, but we've lost any connection to the phase of the previous block. This is exactly a time-frequency flipped version of the phase vocoder. And as opposed to getting a diffuse mess of time, because we lost vertical phase coherence, we're getting a detuned mess of frequency, because we've lost horizontal coherence. If you were paying attention in the intro, you know what's coming next, but some practical notes first. When we read out this input frequency, it was frequency mapped by the shifts that we want. This won't land on a nice integer index, so we need to do some kind of interpolation on this spectrum vertically. Complex numbers interpolate just the same way as real ones. But for mathsy phasey reasons, this interpolation works a lot better if the reference time of your spectrum is bang in the middle of your window. So I would recommend strongly that you do this reference time shift on your input spectrum the moment you get it, assemble your output spectrum that you want, and then do the opposite shift to get it back to where the inverse FFT expects it to be. Okay, so as promised, we're going to make a hybrid pitch and time stretch that kind of marries these two things together. We're going to take an energy observation from an appropriate time and frequency mapped position in the input, and we're going to make two phase predictions. One phase vocoder style one from previous points in time, and one counterpart one from a lower frequency. We know how to blend phases together, so we're going to take a hybrid phase from the two. In fact, we might want to take a weighted average based on which of these has more energy, because if you land exactly on a strong tonal component, then the one previously in time is going to be stronger, so you want to pay more attention to the tonal prediction. A couple of practical notes before we have some listening. Previously, when we looked at our phase vocoder predictions, we weren't doing a frequency shift. We are now, but really it's very simple. You have your frequency estimate and you just multiply it. This is equivalent to multiplying the phase shift that you have between your blocks. Similarly, because there's a lot of time frequency symmetry when you start to get into this stuff, these vertical phase changes also need to be multiplied when you have a time stretch, which we weren't doing last time we did this method. So these vertical phase relationships say something about when events are happening in the input. And here we have some single event happening in our block. And if we multiply all these phase changes between adjacent frequencies, this event moves within the block. This only works if there's only one thing happening, but it's pretty cool because it helps us avoid these doubled up transients, because each of these blocks will have a moved transient so that they match up nicely if you multiply by the same time stretching factor. Also, one more thing, we don't have to stick to just having two phase predictions. I've personally found that it kind of works quite nicely if you take a few different frequency offsets. So the nearest bin, and I tried 2, 4, 8, and 16, and blended them all together. So you have just a few different phase things, observations that you're taking. It's a bit more awkward if you want to take a phase prediction that's not in a straight line, because it's less clear what that phase change should be scaled by if you're multiplying by both time and frequency factors. But yeah, okay, so just to summarize, we're getting our observations from energy, from the input mapped through frequency and time. We're making two predictions, a horizontal phase vocoder one to get the tonal stuff, a vertical one to get the timing right, and we're doing some possibly weighted average of the two. Let's have a listen. I think that's pretty good. Let's listen to it working as a time stretcher. So here's the 25% stretch. Now, we already heard those earlier in the talk, so let's push it a bit. Here's a full octave shift. I'm not going to tackle like formant compensation and that kind of stuff, but I think it's smooth and the drums are still nice and tight. Here is a time stretch by 200%. Cool. So That works. I quite like that. To really try and hear some of these artifacts, we're going to do a round trip by an octave. So we're going to shift our audio up by an octave, and then take that and shift it down by an octave so we can do a more direct comparison with our input. And here's the original input again, just to remind you. Now, we're always going to lose the top octave when we do this round trip because that octave gets shifted above Nyquist and we lose it. But here it is with our hybrid phase method. I think that's pretty clear. And to put that in context with a few other ones, here is the same octave round trip done with an unnamed commercial pitch shifting library. When you listen back closely on YouTube later, I think the transients are clearer with that, but the texture of the sustained and the sort of the big atmosphere is less smooth, it's more grainy. Here's another commercial alternative, actually a dual licensed one. This one is based on a phase vocoder, and you can really hear the phase resets happening if you go and listen back to this. I think that's really interesting. You get to hear these methods in action. And just for fun, here I've compared against SOX, which is a Wazola one where you shift the blocks in time. No disrespect to the SOX team, but it's a bit uneven in time. You get those double transients. Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff I don't have time to cover, including we had this kind of nonlinear time thing where you locally stopped the time stretch across transients. There is a frequency equivalent where you have a nonlinear frequency map. There's no requirement for our frequency map to be linear. So you can similarly kind of push and pull the frequency map so that you do less frequency stretch across strong harmonics. This helps keep the sound smoother when you're doing more extreme stretches, much as the nonlinear time helps you when you're doing more extreme time stretches. I also haven't talked about the shape of these time frequency observations. That's a whole really cool area that I love. And when you look at this, you can ask the question, if you're doing a matched pitch shift and time stretch, is that equivalent to doing the resample? And if you pay attention the right way, yeah, this method can do exactly that. You can make sure that these two things fit together. And there's a whole other bunch of stuff with like adaptive things and wavelets and so on, but like maybe another year. That is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions that aren't covered here, get in touch, or if there's any other project, pitch shifter or not, that you'd like to ask me about, and I'd love to get involved with that kind of thing, I love it. So yeah, thank you very much.